Um, yeah, so tonight, exciting, Sri Lanka. Those of you that have watched our webinars before will know the drill. First of all, I'll give you a little bit of spiel about myself and how I set up Wild Frontiers. And then tonight, I'll tell you a little bit about my journey to Sri Lanka, which I have just got back from. I was there at the beginning of this month for 9 days on a whistle-stop tour. Bizarrely, out of the 85 countries that Wild Frontiers offer, I've been to about 95% of them, but I had never been to Sri Lanka until this year. So that was a real treat, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Then, of course, we have a man that really knows his stuff about Sri Lanka. We have Gavin Thomas, who's going to talk about Sri Lanka in much more detail than I could. Then I'll take back over again to talk about some of the practicalities of traveling to Sri Lanka before we have a Q&A session at the end. So, bit of housekeeping. If you would like to ask a question, please do so. Use the Q&A button at the bottom, and we'll get round, hopefully, to most of the questions and answer them tonight. Tomorrow, we will send out an email with a link to the recording of this webinar, so you can watch it again if you like, or share with friends. Or indeed, if you're not watching it live, of course, which I suspect there are quite a few of you aren't, then you'll be able to click that link and go through and watch it whenever you like. So without further ado, let me crack on, because I think we have quite a lot to discuss tonight. So I was here, wasn't I? And I rather abruptly stopped that. So let me tell you, yes, my name's Jonny Bealby. I founded Wild Frontiers after a decade of adventures in the 90s. I rode a motorbike around Africa. I walked through parts of India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and I rode a horse along the Silk Road. And those 3 journeys gave rise to 3 travel books: Running with the Moon, about the motorcycle journey; For a Pagan Song, about the walk through India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan; and Silk Dreams, Troubled Road, about the horse riding journey. What, of course, they also gave rise to was Wild Frontiers. It was while I was traveling in Pakistan that somebody suggested that I start a travel company bringing travelers there, and I thought that was very good advice. And after my 3rd book, that's exactly what I did. I took my first group up there in October 1998. So next year we will have our 25th anniversary, which is quite exciting. However, we now run trips to about 85 destinations, as I was saying, but one of them that I had never been to was, of course, Sri Lanka. And even though we as a company have been selling Sri Lanka for more than a decade, and it's been a popular place, particularly recently, yeah, I hadn't been. Two major kind of holes in my travel CV, really. One is Sri Lanka, the other is Nepal. Considering I've spent so much time in South Asia, it's surprising that I've never been to either of those 2 destinations, but I hadn't until just the other day. And yeah, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. It was absolutely fascinating. I was actually in India. I've been in India for 10 days or more. I've been up to Kashmir, and I kind of bounced straight through Delhi to Colombo to see what all the fuss was about, I suppose. And I had a fabulous time. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my trip, but of course, I don't want to steal the thunder of our special guest speaker tonight. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, because he will go into detail about all the places that I went to. But the first thing I just want to address is the elephant in the room. Now, when you're talking about Sri Lanka, you quite often talk about elephants, both wild ones, white ones, and ones in the room. And I think it's important to kind of kick off straight away with talking about the financial and political crisis that the country is kind of currently enduring. I'm sure many of you will have been reading the news about Sri Lanka and will be wondering whether it's a sensible place to go to at the moment. So I don't want to go into too much detail, because as I say, I'm sure you all know roughly what's going on there, but let me just give you a very brief kind of update and perspective on it. So essentially, the country is pretty much bankrupt, to be perfectly honest. Very little in the way of foreign reserves, which means it's struggling to pay the interest on its debt. It's finding it very hard to buy exports such as oil, gas, medical supplies, etc. If Sri Lanka was a business, it would be calling in the administrators. And this has essentially been caused by a perfect storm of, first of all, the Easter terrorist attack, which took place in 2019, then followed by COVID. And of course, on top of that, you've then got chronic mismanagement and alleged corruption on a gargantuan scale. So talking about the Easter bombings and COVID, of course, the Easter bombings happened in 2019 and were a massive shock to everybody, no more so than the Sri Lankans. The whole tourist industry kind of reeled at this because Sri Lanka is not a country that one would normally associate with this sort of situation. And just as tourism was starting to recover that autumn and winter, of course, COVID struck. And so really cut off the kind of green shoots of the recovery very quickly. And tourism indeed, was closed for over 18 months. So despite the country having what might be described as a relatively good pandemic, in that they've avoided the second big wave in January 2022. They've had a very solid vaccination process with over 70% of the population now double vaxxed and 35% actually having had boosters. And they were the first country in the region to open up to tourists again in September 2021. They've still had 18 months where they haven't had any tourism. And if you combine that with a closing of the tea and textile industries, which are two other major deliverers of foreign currency, and the fact that many of the workers, migrant workers, or people that worked overseas used to send home a huge amount of revenue, that all stopped as well. So you had this kind of perfect storm of all these elements that would normally fill the exchequer with foreign currency being suddenly cut off. And then you add to that the massive white elephant projects that have caused so much corruption. So these are generally massive infrastructure projects that have been put in place in Sri Lanka. Now, some of them are pretty good. You look at the motorway system, this incredible expressway that's got 260 kilometers of immaculate motorways running through the country. And of course, they make life for the tourist really quite easy because you can get from A to B very simply, but there simply aren't really enough cars on the road to warrant it. Then you've got the extraordinary huge port at Hambantoti, which was kind of financed by the Chinese. The Sri Lankans couldn't pay the debt, therefore the Chinese now effectively own it, which from a geopolitical strategic point of view is pretty clever from their perspective. You've got the massive new airport, the Rajapaksa airport, just next door to the port, which again, nobody uses. And perhaps most contentious of all, you have the Lotus Tower in Colombo, which cost $350 million to build, was opened over a year ago and still is not being used for anything. And of course, when you have massive infrastructure projects, there is plenty of scope for raking a bit of money off. And it's said that there is a $19 billion black hole in the Sri Lankan economy. So what does this do? Well, it leaves the people suffering. It's always the people that suffer. And I thought this sign kind of summed it up quite well. I was out there, as I say, I arrived on the 31st evening and I was there through to the 9th, and that was when most of the demonstrations and stuff were going on. There were some fairly major demonstrations and there was a curfew put in place for my first Saturday, but did it affect me as a tourist? And the real answer to that is no. I mean, one of the big issues facing the country, and in fact I had here in Oxfordshire the other day, was a lack of diesel. Imports of fuel have been a real problem. And so the travel companies have to be fairly clever and just have fuel depots of their own, because sometimes the petrol stations haven't got any. So we had to fill up with jerry cans just once, and that was fine. And our partners out there are very good at making sure that we could fill up when we needed to. But aside from that, really I had no knowledge of, or at least no sighting of, any of the demonstrations. One of the things that's really important is that both the government and the people absolutely want tourism to continue. They're desperate for tourists to come because it's such a major source of foreign income. Indeed, it represents over nearly 13% of GDP. So it's a massively important part of their economy, both for the government exchequer and also for the individuals that work within tourism who are desperate to see us there. So aside from that, and one night, one of my hotels had a power cut, so my AC went off. It really didn't affect me at all. It was interesting, obviously, to hear about, and it was sad to hear the stories of the Sri Lankans with, prices going up in the shops and fuel becoming scarce, and it obviously becoming harder for them to live their normal lives. But as regards the kind of tourist infrastructure and the tourist experience, it made no difference whatsoever. So is Sri Lanka still a place that tourists can travel to safely and have a very good experience? The answer is unequivocally yes. So that was my experience there. Let me just quickly tell you about the journey that I did. So I started in Colombo and I did a kind of clockwise loop of the southwest of the country, heading through most of the highlights. Being that it was my first trip and I only had 9 days, I couldn't go too off the beaten track, but what I did, I absolutely loved. And I'll just quickly tell you roughly about it. So the first place I went to was Sigiriya, which is one of the premier sites of Sri Lanka. Again, I'm not going to talk about it too much because I'm sure Gavin will. An incredible citadel, you climb to the top, beautiful views, 5th century, an amazing, amazing place. And from here, I traveled on this clockwise route around the country. I learned about the Buddhist culture. I met this beautiful elephant called Manika, who I fed, who had been saved from the logging industry and was being looked after by our partners out there. I learned about the spice trade and the history of that. And I visited some wonderful towns. That is a picture of Kandy. I then took the train up into the hill stations to learn about the tea trade and went down to Yala National Park, where I saw a wild elephant, a number of different animals, some beautiful birds, including this little green bee eater, and even the tail of a leopard. I didn't quite see her head because she shot into the bushes, but I did see the rear end of a leopard. I visited markets, saw some curious sights like the stilt fishermen, had a great walking tour with this chap called Mark Forbes in Colombo, showing me all the colonial sites. And of course I ate magnificent food. And what was a real, I don't say surprise, but a real joy was some of the hotels I stayed at, which were absolutely magnificent. Some of the best hotels I've ever had the good fortune to stay at. In fact, at this one, I met 3 Wild Frontiers clients, which was very nice. Had a nice chat with them. I was slightly worried because they had been to Sigiriya. You can see Sigiriya in the background. I had seen them there the evening before and it had been a massive downpour and I was worried they hadn't made it to the top, but they had, and they'd had a great time. So it was very nice to see them there. So that's a kind of whistle-stop version of my tour. You'll of course learn a lot more about these sites as Gavin starts to take over. So without further ado, let me kind of hand over the reins to Gavin. Hang on just a second, that's it. Yeah, so Gavin Thomas has been traveling ever since he was old enough to fall off a bicycle and has visited more than 60 countries, ranging from Argentina to New Zealand, surviving on the road hazards, including being shot at by bandits in Mexico, being chased by wild elephants in India, and being forced to consume dangerously large quantities of airline cuisine. As the author of The Rough Guide to Sri Lanka, he's been visiting the island for over 20 years, traveling to every corner of one of Asia's most magical destinations. Other writing credits include The Rough Guide to Myanmar, Rajasthan, Cambodia, Dubai, and Oman, and along with dozens of other guidebooks for publishers, including Insight, Berlitz, Fromer's, Time Out, and Dawn and Kindersley. So, Gavin, that's a bit of a big build-up. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonny. Hello, everyone, and many thanks for joining us this evening, or whatever time it happens to be, wherever you are. Jonny has set me the almost impossible task of trying to introduce Sri Lanka in just 30 minutes. So it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But I'll be here for questions afterwards for as long as you need me, if there's anything I've missed out or if you need any more information about absolutely anything. So please do just ping us any questions you might have and I'll do my best to answer them. So, right, I'm going to try and start sharing my screen now. Whoops, sorry, technologically incompetent here. Right, I hope that's working. No, it's not. There we go. Right. So my name's Gavin Thomas, and I'm the author of The Rough Guide to Sri Lanka. I think without question, the best guidebook to the island ever published. I started work on the first edition of the guide back in 2002, and I've been updating it ever since, as well as writing and contributing to a bunch of other books, including guides by Insight, Berlitz, and Dawn and Kindersley. I first visited Sri Lanka in 2001, so this year is the 21st anniversary of my involvement with the island. Obviously, I'm a massive fan, and hopefully I can give you a taste of the country and all the amazing things it has to offer. So the first and I think most important question, why should you visit Sri Lanka? So I'm going to make a rather big claim here. Now, obviously I am completely biased, but I've traveled pretty extensively in most parts of the world. And it's my honest belief that Sri Lanka offers more world-class attractions in a smaller space than any other destination on the planet. Just the headline attractions, we're talking a plethora of outstanding sites, ancient monuments, Buddhist temples, colonial heritage, we're talking world-class wildlife, brilliant beaches, and a really stunningly varied array of landscapes, not to mention fabulous food and heaps of truly gorgeous places to stay. Plus, the country is really well set up for tourists. Pretty much everyone you're likely to meet will speak at least a bit of English, and many people speak really good English. And above all, Sri Lankans are a truly warm and friendly bunch of people who will make you feel genuinely welcome. I should perhaps also add that in the light of the current economic crisis, now is absolutely the best time to visit, since the ordinary Sri Lankans who depend on tourist revenues for their livelihoods really need visitors, and your trip to Sri Lanka will be an enormous help during a very difficult period for the country. So big sales pitch there, which I'll try to break down a bit. I'm going to start by taking you on a little virtual whistle-stop tour of the island, during which I'll introduce you to some of Sri Lanka's greatest hits, with a bit of history and background along the way, just to put things into context. So let's begin at the beginning of Sri Lankan history and start with the island's amazing array of ancient Buddhist monuments, in particular the two great ruined cities of Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, and as John has mentioned, the amazing rock-top citadel of Sigiriya. Now, these are all located in the area known as the Cultural Triangle, which you can hopefully see picked out in colour on the map towards the northern centre of the island there. So what's the story? Let's just step back to around the year 500 BC, give or take. It's around this time that the first ancestors of the modern Sri Lankans start arriving in the island. Historians are still arguing over the details, but basically it seems that there were three main waves of migrations from India into Sri Lanka. The ancestors of the modern Sri Lankan Tamils came over from southern India, that's the pink arrow, and settled in the far north of the island. Meanwhile, further waves of settlers arrived from northern India, landing on the east and the west coasts, that's the blue arrows. These guys and girls were the ancestors of the modern Sinhalese, who now make up around 3/4 of the population of Sri Lanka. I'm going to get back to the Tamils later on, but for the time being, we're going to stick with the ancient Sinhalese, who ended up settling across the northern plains with their capital at Anuradhapura, which you can maybe just about see at the end of the blue arrow on the left. Then, in around 250 BC, something amazing happened. Up in India, the legendary ruler of the Mauryan dynasty, the Emperor Ashoka, had recently converted to Buddhism, and in his enthusiasm, he sent missionaries off to various places to preach the new faith. Some of these ended up in Sri Lanka and made their way to Anuradhapura, where, according to legend, they apparently succeeded in converting the entire Sinhalese population to Buddhism in a single day. Well, something like that. We don't know the exact details, but it does seem like there was a massive and rapid conversion to the new religion. This was probably the most formative event in the entire history of Sri Lanka, and one which still fundamentally shapes the island today. I think that without Buddhism, Sri Lanka might well have ended up as a kind of cultural extension of India. The interesting thing for me is actually how very different Sri Lanka is compared to India, despite the fact that the two countries are physically extremely close, and the fact that virtually all Indians are basically of all Sri Lankans are basically of Indian descent. Nevertheless, life in Sri Lanka has a very distinctive flavour, quite different to India, I think. And I think a lot of this comes down to the island's Buddhist faith. So let's rewind to 250 BC. Buddhism has just arrived, and suddenly the Sinhalese have got a new religion, a new set of beliefs, a whole new cultural identity. And to celebrate this, they basically embark on one of the ancient world's great building extravaganzas. They build stupas and temples and shrines and monasteries. And they carry on building and building and building for approximately the next 1,500 years. And the remains of this great golden age of Sinhalese civilization is what you can now see in Sri Lanka's cultural triangle today. So Anuradhapura, the first capital of ancient Sri Lanka. Anuradhapura was without doubt one of the leading cities of its age anywhere in the world. Think of it as a sort of Singapore of ancient South Asia. It was one of the world's leading centers of Buddhist learning, with dozens of monasteries and literally thousands of monks. It was a very complex and highly organized society supported by this incredible network of lakes and canals and irrigation works, which allowed it to produce incredible amounts of agricultural produce, which in turn supported the city's monasteries and great building works. It was a major trading center with links across Asia and beyond. Archaeologists have even found Roman coins here, suggesting that back when Jesus was still a kid, Anuradhapura already had commercial links to places thousands of miles away on the far side of what was then the known world. So what's left of this ancient metropolis, and what do you see today? Well, the first and most obvious thing you see are these absolutely huge stupas, like the one in the picture. And by huge, I mean huge. After the Great Pyramids of Egypt, these are actually the second largest surviving monuments from anywhere in the ancient world. And the stupa in the picture, the Jetavana, is still the largest structure in the world, made entirely of bricks, 90 million of them. That's 90 followed by 6 noughts, which is an awful lot of bricks, especially in an age before machines when every single one had to be made by hand. So that's pretty staggering, really. Here's another one of the main stupas, Ruvenvelisia. You can see that this one's been restored and covered in plaster, so you can't actually see the brickwork. Although if you look at the guys on the ladder in the picture on the left, you again get a sense of the sheer scale of the thing. And there's another view of the same stupa from the base, which again highlights the crazy size of the thing. So you've got this series of massive stupas towering over the landscape, and down at ground level, you've got this vast expanse of ruins, mile after mile of shrines, statues, temples, bathing pools, monasteries, palaces, many of which still boast these incredibly intricate carvings like the moonstone and the guardstone here. It's really difficult to capture the scale of the place in a couple of photos. You really need to experience it. You can hop in a taxi or a rickshaw and do a whistle-stop tour of the main sites, but I really recommend, if possible, getting hold of a bike and spending a day just cycling around the ruins and absorbing the atmosphere. Go up to the northern part of the city, in particular around the Abhayagiri Stupa. A lot of the area here is still wooded, and it's a marvelous place to just wander, you know, maybe getting a bit lost, stumbling across random ruins amongst the trees and just getting a feel for the size of the ancient city. So Anuradhapura survived as the Sinhalese capital for over 1,000 years, you know, a seriously long and impressive lifespan. The problem was that the city became so wealthy over the centuries that it was basically a huge magnet for invaders from southern India who attacked and ransacked the city repeatedly until it was finally abandoned. At which point the Sinhalese decided to move their capital to somewhere a bit further away from India. So off they go and establish a new capital to the southeast at Polonnaruwa. This is the second of the great ancient Sinhalese capitals. It didn't last nearly as long as Anuradhapura, you know, a mere 200 years or so, but just long enough for one final creative flourish. Think of it as the last hurrah of ancient Sri Lanka's golden age. It's much smaller and more compact than Anuradhapura, although it's still big enough that you'll need wheels to get around. And again, I strongly recommend renting a bike if you can. So there's plenty here that's pretty similar to Anuradhapura. Lots more stupas, including this giant edifice, the Menik Vihara. You've got more ruined palaces and temples and statues. On the left here, you've got the ruins of the Lanka Tilaka temple with a giant Buddha, now missing its head sadly, standing at the end, while on the right is a famous statue said to be of the guy who founded Polonnaruwa, King Parakramabahu. People still argue about exactly what he's holding here. Either it's a set of ancient Buddhist scriptures or a slice of mango. You decide. There are a couple of places at Polonnaruwa, though, which are really special, I think, and which are the absolute culmination of ancient Sri Lankan art. The first is the area known as the Quadrangle, where you'll find this fabulous cluster of temples and other remains in an incredible range of contrasting styles, including this wonderful circular shrine known as the Vatadaga, which is probably the most iconic and beautiful building from the whole of Sri Lanka's early history. The other place is the Gaul Vihara. This is basically a Buddhist sculpture gallery comprising 4 large statues, including this stunning 14-meter long figure of the reclining Buddha at the moment of his death and entry into nirvana. I think that if you had to choose just one image or object to encapsulate the whole of Sri Lankan history, culture, and identity, this might be the one. there's so much going on here, the enormous size of the figure, the incredible skill shown by the artists who somehow managed to chisel this extraordinarily delicate creation out of a huge block of solid rock, using what would have been the most rudimentary tools, the way in which the natural lines and textures within the stone have been brought out to enhance the emotion of the carving. Perhaps above all, this kind of superhuman serenity which the figure of the dying Buddha encapsulates, which seems to me the perfect embodiment of the Buddhist faith in Sri Lanka. You know, a truly incredible creation, really. So next, probably the highlight of the cultural triangle, Sigiriya. So this is Sigiriya rock, which is probably the most outlandish and eye-catching natural landmark in the entire island. You know, a huge slab of orange sandstone bursting out of the northern plains, a kind of Sri Lankan Ayers rock, if you like. So it's the 5th century AD, and Sri Lanka is now ruled by a particularly unhinged king called Karsapa. And King Karsapa decides he's fed up of Anuradhapura and he wants to build himself a new royal palace. And he decides that the obvious, most logical, most practical place to build his new palace is on top of probably the biggest and most inaccessible rock in the whole of Sri Lanka, which makes perfect sense. And believe it or not, that's exactly what he did. Here you can see the remains of Karsapa's royal citadel, covering the entire summit of the rock. Crazy but true. So you want to climb the rock, of course you do, and it's actually not nearly as strenuous or indeed scary as you might think. Here's the approach through the ancient water gardens which Karsapa built around the base of the rock, after which you start climbing. There's a couple of hundred stone steps at first, after which you reach the rather rusty looking metal staircase, which you can see on the left, which takes you all the way to the top. There are all sorts of historical bits and pieces to see on the way up, including most famously the so-called Sigiriya damsels, one of whom you can see on the right, an amazing picture gallery of celestial beauties which Karsapa had painted onto a section of rock face just below the summit. No one's quite sure why, but there you are. Continuing up, these pictures show the view from just below the summit, looking down over the surrounding plains and the water gardens which you walked through right at the start of the walk. After which you make the final climb up to the summit. At this point, the metal staircase is basically bolted onto the rock face, and things get a little bit exciting for a moment. If in doubt, don't look down, basically. So those are the 3 big highlights of the cultural triangle. There's loads more to the area. Sigiriya is very easily combined with a trip to see the marvelous cave temples in Dambulla, stuffed with these beautiful old statues and some of the most amazing murals in the island, such as this rather lovely picture of demons on one side and angels on the other. Not to mention this fellow here, one of the many supersized modern Buddha statues which you'll see around the island. And yes, that really is a 4-story building in front of him, which gives you some sense of the scale of the thing. Beyond here, there are absolutely heaps of other sites in the cultural triangle which you can visit if you really develop a taste for ancient Sinhalese art. More giant Buddha statues, more ruined cities, forest monasteries, all sorts of other stuff, which sadly I don't have time to get into, but which is absolutely worth exploring. And many of these places see hardly any tourists if you want to get away from the crowds. So, Polonnaruwa lasted until around 1200 AD, at which point history repeats. Those pesky Indian invaders returned yet again and destroyed the city, and the Sinhalese started moving south yet again, and continued wandering south for a couple more centuries before eventually establishing a new capital, which is also the next highlight on our list, and that's Kandy. Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa are obviously essentially historical sites and now largely in ruins. Kandy, by contrast, still one of the biggest towns in Sri Lanka, still very much alive and kicking. It's also what you might call the cultural capital of Sri Lanka, a kind of living embodiment of the island's Buddhist traditions. This is mainly due to the presence of this building, the Temple of the Tooth, Sri Lanka's most revered Buddhist shrine. According to legend, the tooth in question belonged to the Buddha himself. It was rescued from his funeral pyre in northern India, came to Sri Lanka, and after all sorts of exciting adventures, ended up in Kandy in the year 1592. It's now kept in the small room behind the gold door on the right in a special shrine. you can't actually see the tooth itself. It's normally only shown to high-level dignitaries. So unless you're a visiting head of state, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. The Temple of the Tooth is actually part of a much larger complex of buildings, which was once the Palace of the Kings of Kandy. It's a fascinating place to explore, full of old buildings, including several museums where you'll find the stuffed remains of Sri Lanka's most famous elephant, along with all sorts of other weird and wonderful artifacts. If you go on one of the temples, the daily temple ceremonies, you'll also see guys like these drummers, dressed in traditional Kandyan costumes, who play during each of the ceremonies. They can also be seen every evening at these shows of traditional Sri Lankan drumming and dancing, which are held at various places around town. These are touristy, but also really great fun. And some of the drumming and dancing has to be seen and indeed heard to be believed. And finally, you can also catch them during Kandy's Esla Perahera. This is the biggest and most spectacular festival in Sri Lanka, and definitely worth catching if you find yourself in the island in late July or early August. The exact dates vary year by year. There's a load of other stuff you can do while you're in Kandy. The wonderful Peradeniya Botanical Gardens are just outside town, and it's also a good base for visits to the Pinawala Elephant Orphanage, which I'll talk about later, as well as a couple of other elephant sanctuaries, plus a load of other temples in the surrounding countryside, and hiking trips into the nearby Knuckles Range, one of the island's most spectacular wilderness areas, and a brilliant place for a long walk. So, excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. Moving swiftly on, let's talk about Sri Lanka's amazingly rich colonial heritage and history. Dutch, Portuguese, British, covering around 4.5 centuries of the island's history. So the Portuguese were the first Europeans to arrive, hot on the heels of Vasco da Gama, who just opened up the sea route from Europe to India. The first bunch of Portuguese landed in 1505 and saw loads of great stuff which they really wanted. Elephants, and therefore ivory, spices, lots of spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, super valuable stuff back in the early 16th century. So a few years later, in 1518, the Portuguese return, and this time they've come to stay. So they build a small fort at a rather obscure west coast village called Colombo, which eventually is going to turn into the city of Colombo, and start taking over the coast until they're in control of most of the island, which they then hang on to for around 150 years. You won't see much, well, you won't see any real physical evidence of the Portuguese era in Sri Lanka, although they did have a big influence on the island's culture, mainly due to the fact that Portuguese missionaries converted large numbers of Sinhalese and Tamils, which is why there's still a significant Christian minority and some seriously big churches in Sri Lanka to this day. It also explains the curious fact why so many Sri Lankans have got Portuguese surnames. On this lovely collection of signs, for instance, you can see you've got a Mr. Vikramaratna, a Mr. Aluvahara, a Mr. Valgampaya, all mixed up with a Mr. De Silva and a Mr. Fernando, which is somehow so very Sri Lankan. So moving on, 17th century, and the Dutch begin casting covetous looks at Sri Lanka until in 1638, they start attacking Portuguese positions around the coast. And after around 20 years of fighting in 1656, finally succeed in wresting control of the island from the Portuguese and becoming the second of Sri Lanka's colonial overlords. Unlike the Portuguese era, you can still see plenty of physical remains of the Dutch period in Sri Lanka, including a string of forts, churches, and all sorts of other buildings around the coast. But the absolute gem of the Dutch period and the next destination on our tour is Gaul. So Gaul was originally one of the various forts which the Dutch captured from the Portuguese, located, as you can see, on its own little peninsula at the southwesternmost point of the island. And apologies for the rather blurry image. Over the years, the Dutch expanded the fortifications to enclose pretty much the entire peninsula in a huge chain of ramparts and bastions, part of which you can see here. Ironically, the fortifications which the Dutch put so much effort into constructing never actually saw any kind of military action. But 2004, the Asian tsunami hits Gaul with appalling force. The modern town outside the walls is more or less flattened, but the wave hits the old Dutch fortifications and basically just bounces off again, leaving the area inside the walls almost completely unscathed and probably saving hundreds of lives, which I think is a marvelous tribute to the skill of the Dutch engineers who constructed the walls all those many years ago. So inside the walls, this is where the magic really begins. You've basically got a perfectly preserved little little 18th century Dutch town filled with these gorgeous time-warped old buildings. Here's the seafront with the old lighthouse. Here's the great warehouse where the Dutch would used to store all the valuable spices and other commodities before they were shipped off to Europe. On the left here, you can see the old main gateway into the fort with the coat of arms of the Dutch East India Company over the arch. And here on the right, you can see the old Dutch church, while on the left, you've got the rather overpowering Anglican church, which was added by the British when they took over the town, complete with the obligatory post office and red letter box. So Gaul is a really special and magical place, and I think an essential stop on any tour of the island. So moving on now to the very end of the 18th century, it's just after the French Revolution. Europe's a war on the Netherlands has fallen to the armies of Napoleon. It's 1796, and the British take control of Sri Lanka, allegedly to protect it on behalf of the Dutch against French forces. The Dutch obviously aren't too happy about this, but don't put up a fight. And so the British era begins. So I think that the British bequeathed Sri Lanka many things. As in India, they constructed an extensive railway network, complete with all the latest cutting-edge 19th century technology, including these state-of-the-art live travel updates. They gave the island a parliamentary democracy, which is still just about functioning, even in the light of recent events. Even more importantly, they introduced the game of cricket, which is still Sri Lanka's great sporting obsession. You won't spend long in the island before someone starts talking to you, starts asking you about Joe Root or Ben Stokes, so be prepared. They built swathes of impressive colonial buildings, which you can see in Colombo, Kandy, New Aurelia, and many other places. But probably the most important thing they did in Sri Lanka, and the thing which most profoundly shaped the country's landscape and economy, was the introduction of tea. Which brings us on to the next of our featured highlights and my own personal absolute favourite part of Sri Lanka, the hill country. So most of Sri Lanka is low-lying and kind of flat, but in the area south of Kandy, the landscape suddenly becomes high and wild and in places really quite mountainous. Another of Sri Lanka's many amazing contrasts. There it is. Historically, this part of the island was cloaked in dense forest and pretty much inaccessible. Then the British arrived and decided that things were going to change. So they started moving gradually into the hill country, clearing the forest and creating the first commercial plantations. Except it's not tea at this stage, it's coffee. Coffee is the big thing to begin with. Everyone starts planting coffee and making loads of money. It's like a gold rush, except with coffee. What could possibly go wrong? What actually went wrong was a nasty little leaf disease, which during the 1870s ripped through all those beautiful new coffee plantations and basically killed off the entire coffee industry. Complete disaster, or at least it was until an enterprising Scotsman named James Taylor established the island's first tea plantation near Kandy, and the rest is history. Tea proved perhaps even more successful than coffee and obviously still plays a major role in the island's economy to this day. So the tea industry basically transformed the hill country landscape into what you see today from this to this, which for me always looks like the supreme combination of wild nature and human nurture, if you like. You've got these rugged, semi-mountainous uplands dressed in interminable mile after mile after mile of these immaculately trimmed tea bushes. Sometimes it looks like there's not even a single leaf out of place, you know, as if every bush has been given its own individual manicure. Most of the tea picking is still done by ladies like these, the descendants of Indian Tamil plantation workers originally brought to the island by the British during the 19th century. One of the hill country's iconic sites, although sadly, despite looking incredibly picturesque, they're still amongst the poorest people in the island. So a super quick tour of the hill country. The best introduction to the area is without a doubt a ride on the Hill Country Railway. Definitely get on board if you can, even if it's only for a short ride. And it's also a great way of getting from Kandy to our first stop, the capital of the hill country, New Aurelia. So New Aurelia, established by the British and still a popular country resort. This is more or less at the very centre of the hill country and therefore the highest and coldest part of the island. I kind of love the fact that the British decided to establish their main hill country settlement in one of the few places in the entire island where you're pretty much guaranteed a bit of rain and cold weather at almost any time of the year. It feels like there's a real sort of homesick nostalgia at work there. So remember to take a jumper and something waterproof, since it can get not only wet, but also surprisingly chilly after dark. New Aurelia, popularly known as Little England, and the whole place still has this weird kind of old world British flavour, complete with your typical Victorian churches, a couple of old-fashioned shops, and a truly outstanding selection of proper English vegetables, which were introduced by the British and are still grown locally today. If you want a real taste of life in colonial Ceylon, there's also a trio of these wonderfully old and creaky 19th century hotels to try. The Grand Hotel, St Andrews, and the Hill Club. I particularly like the Hill Club on the bottom of the slide, which still feels like a marvellous time capsule of old Ceylon, complete with those lovely old signs and other colonial bits and pieces. So it's also a good place for visits to Horton Plains National Park. This, I think, is the most beautiful, scenically the most beautiful national park in Sri Lanka. A wonderfully wild stretch of sort of upland moors dotted with waterfalls and clumps of cloud forest. It's also the only Sri Lankan national park where you're allowed to walk around, and features this amazing circular walk leading to a viewpoint known as World's End. The hill country is full of incredible views, but I think this is the best of the lot. You're basically standing right on the edge of the hills here, with the cliffs falling sheer away below you for almost a kilometre, and these jaw-dropping views right across the south of the island all the way to the sea. Fabulous. Continuing along the railway line from New Aurelia, you get to the village of Haputale, which is another destination right on the edge of the southern hills with yet more amazing views. It's also home to the Dambateni tea factory. This was built in 1890 by arguably Sri Lanka's most famous expat, Sir Thomas Lipton, which of course is still one of the most famous names on tea bags around the planet. This was Thomas Lipton's own factory and where his tea empire all started. Apparently after a hard day's work, Sir Thomas would get on his horse and ride up to yet another amazing viewpoint above the factory, which is now known as Lipton's Seat. Sadly, horses are no longer available, but it's another great walk with another great view at the end of it. What you can do here is to take a rickshaw or a taxi up to the viewpoint and then walk downhill all the way back down to the tea factory, which gives you all the benefit of the views with none of the effort of actually having to walk up any hills. So from Haputale, you can hop back on the hill country train for another 30 minutes to reach the village of Ella. This is probably now the most popular destination in the hill country. Again, you're right on the edge of the hills here with this amazing view down over the plains below. Ella itself used to be a sleepy little village, although it's now grown massively in recent years. So not as relaxed as it used to be, although on the upside, it does have a brilliant selection of places today and some quite decent restaurants as well. And it's also one of the best places in Sri Lanka to try a cookery class, and as well as having several more tea factories nearby, which you can visit if you want to find out how a tea factory actually works. The main draw, though, is obviously the surrounding countryside. Lots of gorgeous scenery, waterfalls, and some great walks, including the hike up Ella Rock, which you can see there on the left if you're feeling particularly energetic. Let's conclude my super fast hill country tour with a visit to my final highlight, Adams Peak. One of the island's highest and most dramatic mountains, and also a major pilgrimage centre. According to legend, the Buddha himself came here and stood on the summit, leaving an imprint of his foot embedded in the rock, which of course now attracts thousands of pilgrims a year. Here you can see a very small section of the 6,000 or so steps which lead up to the summit of the mountain. The traditional way of going up the mountain is to do it in the middle of the night, which might sound crazy, but is actually great fun. The steps are all lit up, and there are dozens of little all-night cafes and tea stands along the way, so plenty of places to rest and refresh. Plus, there's usually an interesting crowd of fellow walkers with a mix of tourists, plus lots of Sri Lankans ranging from tiny kids to little old ladies in flip-flops, all dutifully trudging up to pay their respects to the Buddha's footprint at the top. the basic idea is that you set off at 2 or 3 a.m. in the middle of the night so that you reach the summit as the dawn breaks. As you can imagine, this is a really magical sight as the sun rises and gradually reveals this vast swathe of hills stretching away in every direction. Just be aware that it can be seriously cold at the top at daybreak, so take warm clothes or prepare to freeze. So let's fast forward another 250 years. World War II has just finished, and in 1948, Sri Lanka gets its independence back, finally, and we enter the modern era, which brings us to my next highlight, the capital, Colombo. So I'm actually kind of cheating here because there's obviously far more to Colombo than just the modern era, although in the context of Sri Lanka's incredibly long history, it's still a relatively new kid on the block. The first thing you need to know about Colombo is that in the context of Sri Lanka, it's a total anomaly. This is the only really big city in the country, the only proper metropolitan area, the only true urban experience. For me, I always like to go to Colombo at the end of any trip through Sri Lanka, since I think if you've spent a couple of weeks out in the island's sleepy rural backwaters, you really appreciate the excitement and energy of the place. So a very quick city tour. Right at the heart of Colombo, Fort District, the oldest part of the city, built on the site of the original Portuguese fort and now full of these rather grandiose British buildings, as well as this rather quaint structure, which, as you can see, is part clock tower and part lighthouse, right at the very centre of the city, and from which all road distances in Sri Lanka are measured. After which you'll probably want to visit the Peta. This is Colombo's major commercial district. Always packed, always manic, and the one place in Sri Lanka where you get something resembling a sort of an Indian-style sense of crowds and crush, not to mention an absolutely crazy amount of signs. Then there's Slave Island, named by the Dutch, who really did keep slaves here. They even dug a canal to surround the area and filled it with crocodiles to stop people escaping, which was very thoughtful of them. There are a couple of lovely Buddhist temples here, including this one, the Sima Malacca, designed by the famous Sri Lankan architect Geoffrey Bawa. There's also an amazing amount of new development going on here. The last time I visited, there were cranes and half-finished buildings everywhere, including this interesting new edifice, the Leaning Tower of Colombo, as it's already been christened. While in the background, you can see the vast Lotus Tower, which Jonny did briefly mention, a sort of huge purple and green eyesore, which now looms over the entire city, sadly. And then finally, there's Gullface Green. This is where everyone in the city seems to gather at sunset. So if you're in Colombo for just one day, finish here and then go for a cocktail at the lovely old Gullface Hotel, another of the city's famous old British landmarks, which you can just about see in the picture at the far end of the green. Okay, so that's the tour, more or less. I'm going to wrap up by talking about some other Sri Lankan experiences, beginning with a look at Sri Lanka's wild side. In my experience, people don't usually think of Sri Lanka as a particularly notable wildlife destination. But again, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that, in my opinion, Sri Lanka is arguably the best wildlife destination in Asia. Maybe. Again, we're talking about a surprisingly varied array of really top-notch attractions. We don't have tigers in Sri Lanka, admittedly. You'll have to go to India for those. But we've got more wild elephants per square kilometre than anywhere else in Asia. We've got one of the world's best places to see leopards. We've got amazing marine life, including superb whale watching, outstanding bird life, 5 different species of marine turtles, and lots more. Let's start with elephants. I always think of the elephant as Sri Lanka's most iconic animal. You can see carved elephants decorating temples around the island. You'll see real elephants marching in parades during religious festivals, and perhaps spot working elephants out on back roads and in the fields. Although, of course, to really see them properly, you'll have to head to one of the national parks. So you'll find large elephant populations in pretty much all the island's national parks. Possibly the best place is Udawalawe National Park, where there are loads of elephants and relatively little vegetation for them to hide in. The island's most spectacular elephant event, though, happens in Minaria National Park in the Cultural Triangle in around August and September. This is popularly known as the gathering. What happens is that as the water dries up towards the end of the dry season, literally hundreds and hundreds of elephants congregate around the waters of Minaria Lake, some of them walking cross-country for anything up to 50 miles or so. Partly it's to find a reliable water source, partly it's to socialize and maybe find a mate. So it's like a sort of a very extended family reunion for elephants. There are also a number of elephant sanctuaries. You might have heard of the famous Pinawala Elephant Orphanage, not far from Kandy, which is home to around 80 elephants or so. This place has had a bit of a bad reputation in recent years following accusations of animal cruelty, but it seems to have cleaned its act up now, and gives you an amazing chance to get up really close to a wide range of elephants, usually including a few super cute babies. If you do visit, make sure to time your trip to coincide with one of the twice daily bathing sessions, when all the elephants are marched down the road to take a dip in the local river. Quite a sight. Leopards next. Sri Lanka is the best place in Asia, one of the best places in the world to spot these amazing creatures. The place to go is Yala National Park in the southeast. Yala has one of the highest densities of leopards per square kilometre of anywhere on the planet. So if you really want to tick a leopard sighting off your bucket list, now is definitely the time. Even if you don't see a leopard, Yala is still an amazing place, probably the best all-round wildlife destination in Sri Lanka. So hopefully you won't be too disappointed. The other place you might see a leopard is at Walpatu National Park, up on the west coast. Walpatu was absolutely devastated during the Civil War, but it's since recaptured a lot of its former glory and is now arguably one of the top parks in the country. Plus it gets significantly fewer visitors in Yala, so it's generally a lot more peaceful. Sri Lanka is also a world-class whale watching destination, one of the best places anywhere in the world to see blue whales. The place to go is Marissa on the south coast, which is best from December to April. And you can also do trips from Trincomalee on the east coast from around March through to September. There's also great dolphin watching, particularly up around the Kalpitia Peninsula on the west coast. This is a rather blurry picture I took during a trip up there. I mean, I've seen dolphins in many places around the world and I was a bit sort of blasé about it, but I went out in this boat and then suddenly looked out and the entire sea is full of dolphins. There were just hundreds and hundreds of dolphins. Everywhere you look, there were dolphins. It was the most incredible sight and far and away the most impressive bit of dolphin watching I've ever done. As well as dolphins, you've also got 5 different marine turtle species that visit the island. You can see them come ashore at the nesting beach at Rekawa on the south coast to lay their eggs, which is another really magical natural experience. Birds. Sri Lanka is a great bird watching destination. You've got 26 endemic species here, and even if you're not really that into birds, I think you can't fail to be impressed by the island's wonderfully colourful variety of bird life. There are all sorts of different great bird watching destinations around the island, but maybe the absolute top pick is Sinaraja rainforest in the south of the island. This is easily the largest surviving area of rainforest in Sri Lanka and well worth a visit in its own right, with this incredible tangle of dense jungle and enormous trees, although it does make actually seeing birds a bit tricky, so be sure to find yourself a good guide. So, you've been in Sri Lanka for a bit. You've explored the ancient monuments and the colonial towns. You've visited the national parks and gone hiking in the hill country. You're exhausted. You need to lie down. It's time to hit the beach. So you've got over 1,300 kilometers of coastline to choose from here and all sorts of different options. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview rather than getting into too much detail. The basic picture here is that beaches in Sri Lanka essentially vary more or less by coast. The west coast is the most developed. This is where you'll find most of the island's big resorts and the most established beach destinations, including Negombo, right next to the airport, which you may end up spending a night at on your way in or out of the country. My top west coast pick is without doubt Bentota. If you're looking for a bit of shameless luxury and self-indulgence, maybe you're on honeymoon or celebrating an anniversary, this is a great option and is where you'll find some of the island's swankiest resorts and some lovely boutique hotels, plus a huge swathe of sand. Past here, you reach Hikkaduwa and then Unuotuna. These are the island's two big party beaches and the places to head for cheaper accommodation and nightlife. Hikkaduwa was actually the island's first major tourist destination back in the 70s, and it is looking a bit battered now, so you'll probably prefer to head on to Unuotuna. Again, there's been lots of development here over the past couple of decades, but still a great place to get back for a few days. Past Unuotuna, you get onto the main stretch of the south coast. I'm tempted to say that the beaches along the south coast are the best on the island. It's a lot quieter than the west coast, and the emphasis is on what I would call sort of barefoot chic. There are some really nice places to stay here, but they tend to be sort of quite low key, and a lot of them focus on wellness activities, everything from yoga to surfing, rather than flashy rooms and full moon parties. Marissa, which I've already mentioned in connection with whale watching, is the most popular destination in the south, and there are also a string of small villages and cove beaches along the coast, places like Hiruketia and Talala, which are really lovely, but still refreshingly quiet. It's also along the south coast that you'll probably see these guys, Sri Lanka's famous stilt fishermen. I actually suspect that most of them now make more money out of posing for tourist photos rather than actually fishing. In fact, some of them might not even be fishermen at all, but still, hey, they look cute. Just be aware that if you want to photograph them, they may well expect some money in return. Back to beaches, and if you really want to get it away from all, head to the east coast, where you've got a vast swathe of coast with very little development whatsoever. My personal favourite here is Aragon Bay. This was originally a surfing resort and has the best waves in Sri Lanka. But even if you're not into surfing, it's a really fun place to stay with a kind of slightly alternative left field character, a bit of a party atmosphere, and lots of quirky little guest houses offering accommodation in rustic cabanas and stilted huts like the one in this picture. It's not exactly 5-star, but it's definitely something a bit different from your average resort. So the one area I haven't covered yet is the far north. Right at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the arrival of the first settlers from India. We followed the Sinhalese on their long journey south, but meantime, I'm afraid we left the original Tamil settlers hanging in limbo right at the top of the country. So what happened was, as the Sinhalese converted to Buddhism and then moved gradually south, the Tamils largely stayed put up north, retaining their original Hindu beliefs and developing a distinct brand of Sri Lankan Tamil culture, which persists right through to the present day. The north really does feel like a different country. The language is different, the food is different, the music you'll hear played in the streets is different, and instead of Buddhist shrines, you'll see loads of these typically Indian-looking Hindu temples. The main town in the north is Jaffna. It's got wonderful Hindu temples, plus it was also a major colonial centre, and you'll find the remains of a huge Dutch fort, as well as loads of time-warped colonial architecture, and some seriously big churches like this one. Also lots to see in the surrounding Jaffna Peninsula, although for me the best thing to do is to head out into the surrounding islands. The landscape here is really beautiful, unusual. The sea is very shallow, and there's this string of low islands just poking up above the waterline, linked by causeways and little ferries. It's really a very lovely and very different taste of Sri Lanka. So I'm almost out of time, and I'm just going to wrap up by talking very briefly about Sri Lanka's really superb cuisine. As with most things in Sri Lanka, there are all sorts of different influences at work here. I like to think of Sri Lankan cooking as the history of the island on a plate. You basically got an island which is incredibly rich in natural produce, spices, fruits, seafood, and so on. Then you put this together with the country's diverse history and cultures, and you get this incredible mix of Indian, Muslim, Indonesian, Dutch, British, and other influences. What you're looking at in this picture is a typical Sri Lankan rice and curry. As you can see, this bears very little resemblance to your typical Indian curry. In terms of ingredients and flavoring, it's actually probably closer to Southeast Asian cooking. You've got sauces made using coconut milk infused with chilies, curry leaves, and all sorts of other spices. Very clean, sharp flavors. You'll probably also get a serving of Indian-style dal and miniature poppadoms as part of the meal. The very lavish presentation with lots of little servings of different curries in separate bowls is said to have been inspired by the Dutch rice tafel or rice table, which was itself modelled on the Indonesian style of cooking known as nasi padang. So a lot of influences going on there, very Sri Lankan. There are all sorts of other local specialities which you might come across. My personal favourite is the hopper. These might look familiar if you've been to Kerala in India, where they're called appa, which explains the rather bouncy name. These miniature pancakes are made from fermented rice and coconut batter, and they're cooked in little bowls, which means they're sort of deliciously crispy around the top and thicker and chewier at the bottom. You can eat them on their own or with some sauce or pickle on the side, although I reckon they're best at breakfast when they're cooked with a fried egg at the bottom to make an egg hopper, which is pure culinary heaven. Another classic is the Dutch lampreis, which is like a kind of miniature biryani baked in a banana leaf. You'll often see it described as lump rice on menus, although needless to say, it's much tastier than that. Another dish you'll come across is roti. This is a Muslim dish, basically another kind of pancake, a bit like a Sri Lankan crepe, which can be served with either sweet or savoury ingredients, or alternatively chopped up and stir-fried with meat and veg to make this dish here called a kotu roti. And finally, just a word of caution, excuse me. It really helps if you like your food hot. Sri Lankans put chili in just about everything, not to mention plenty of garlic and curry leaves, which add even more heat. And you'll also find that food is generally served with little bowls of garnish like this, classic pol sambal, which is basically grated coconut with chili, lots of chili. So a quick public safety announcement, if you like, this stuff is seriously hot, approach with caution. So that concludes my whistle-stop introduction to Sri Lanka. At this point, I'm really conscious of all the things I haven't mentioned. I haven't really talked about the island's fabulous array of places to stay. I haven't talked about Ayurveda or the island's booming spa industry. I haven't talked about all the great diving, surfing, kite surfing, windsurfing, and a bunch of other water-based stuff. I missed out a heap of places to Katragama, Mannar Island, Bundala, loads of really nice places to go. I haven't mentioned the Vedas, the original inhabitants of Sri Lanka, who can still be found in the East Country. And I haven't talked really at all about the island's fabulous festivals either. Basically, so many highlights, so little time. I could go on, but I'm going to wrap up now and hand back to Jonny. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful trip.
Wow, Gavin, what a lot to take on board. It's kind of fascinating because I feel, having been there for my little 9 days, and even though I saw a fair bit of that, I obviously realized how much I've missed. And what's lovely is that rather like India, it seems to be a place one can go back to time and time again. So thank you so much for that incredibly detailed, and I know you think you've missed a lot, but I'm sure you've filled all of us with a huge amount of information that is just great that we will digest in time. We are running out of time, so let me just quickly go back to sharing my screen and kind of take off from where I left off. So in terms of the practicalities of getting to Sri Lanka at the moment, it is really remarkably simple. First of all, you need a visa. That is the simplest visa I think I have ever got in my life. It took me 20 minutes to fill in the form, and I had the e-visa back to me 10 minutes later. So that was amazing. And then you arrive at the airport and you're stamped through pretty much instantaneously. From touchdown to being in my hotel was an hour. That's about the quickest I think I've ever done it anywhere. So that was fabulous. As far as COVID is concerned, there really aren't any restrictions once you're in the country. There are a couple of things you have to do prior to arriving in the country. So you have to get some Sri Lankan COVID insurance, which costs you $12, another online form, very simple. And then 72 hours before you arrive in Sri Lanka, you have to fill in a health declaration form, which states that you have been, and upload your vaccine status. At the moment, if you have not been vaccinated, you cannot visit Sri Lanka. We're starting to see quite a few countries that are changing that rule. And if you're prepared to take a PCR test, whatever, you're allowed in. But at the moment, Sri Lanka is, you have to be vaccinated. As far as air travel is concerned, BA don't fly to Colombo at the moment, which surprised me. Air Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan Airways do. They are part of the One World Alliance. So if you want to collect your points on BA, you'll still get them with Air Sri Lankan. Or you can go via the Gulf with either Etihad or Qatar. And if you're coming from the States, as far as I know, there are no direct flights to Sri Lanka. So again, my advice would be to go via the Gulf, probably with with Etihad or Qatar. So that's how you get there. Very easy. Couldn't have been easier. In terms of the style of trip you might want to do, so there are two options here. One is taking a tailor-made itinerary. We've got a few. You go onto our site, you look at Sri Lanka, you'll see a number of suggested itineraries that we've put together at various kind of budget levels, various interests. So you can look at those and decide how you would like to kind of do your tailor-made trip. And then, of course, we have Shalmali, our brilliant Shalmali, who is our senior India and Sri Lanka travel consultant. And by talking to her, have a Zoom consultation or just chat to her on the phone or through email, and she will craft you the perfect trip for your budget, your interests, your traveling companions, etc. But of course, and this is the kind of thing that you can do. You can choose which kind of accommodation you want, what experiences you want. You will have a driver, guide. This is Prasad, who took me around for 10 days. Lovely guy, great car. He was not only a superb driver, he was also excellent fun to be with and knew everything there was to know about Sri Lanka. And of course, there's beaches you can go to. But if you really want to splash out, then the Maldives are only a short hop away, 1 hour, 20 minutes, daily flights from Colombo. So what would be an amazing trip would be a kind of 12, 13-day cultural tour of Sri Lanka, and then popping out to the incredible white beaches of the Maldives. But of course, Wild Frontiers is partly, well, I say partly, more than 50%, a group tour company, and we specialize in doing some fabulous group trips. And our group trip to Sri Lanka is kind of how we try to do a lot of our group tours, which is picking out the highlights, trying to do them a bit differently, but also taking people a little bit off the beaten track. And I was delighted to hear Gavin talk about a lot of these places that you would be going to on our trip off the beaten track. So one place that you'll go and see is obviously all the main highlights, such as Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, Galle, Kandy, Sigiriya, etc. But we try and do them a bit differently. So we do bicycle trips around Polonnaruwa. We will do, not only do we climb to the top of Sigiriya, but we also go on a kind of village walk and meet villagers there. In Galle, we'll do a kind of cultural walking tour of the colonial sites, which is so fascinating. But we'll also throw in some kind of offbeat stuff. Gavin, just for a moment there, spoke about the Veda people in Dambana, which we will go and see. As far as leopards are concerned, we're going to go and see them, or try and see them, I should say, up in Wilpatu National Park, which, as Gavin was saying, is much less visited than Yala National Park. We go for a walk in the Knuckles Forest Reserve, and then we have lots of other kind of interesting experiences, cooking lessons and things like that to make things a little bit more interesting. And as Gavin was just explaining, we also go and see elephants in the Udawalawe National Park. This was created as to protect the species to protect all wildlife after the sanctuary was made for the construction of the Udawalawe Reserve. So this was kind of created for them. And it's probably, as Gavin was saying, the best place to see wild elephants. You see wild elephants everywhere. I mean, you have to be careful when you're driving. One was walking down the road, across the road. We also saw one in a lake by side, which was great. So you will see wild elephants just about everywhere, but this is probably the best place. And you'll stay in some fabulous accommodation on the group trip, including the big game camp in Wilpatu, which is tented camp, which would be very exciting. So just to quickly sum up, I mean, I've got to be honest, I suppose one of the reasons why I'd never been to Sri Lanka was because I think I had kind of in my head got this idea that it was India-like, that it was going to be like India, just not quite as interesting. I was completely wrong. I really found Sri Lanka to be a place that had a unique character and a place with a huge diversity of landscapes, cuisine, culture, history. The people are, and I know I kind of tend to say this on every webinar, but the people of Sri Lanka really are among the sweetest, kindest, nicest people you'll ever meet. And it's just a great place for a kind of holiday / travel experience. So yeah, I can't believe it's taken me all these years to get there. It was my 104th country, I think, but I will be back. So just to quickly finish off, we've got other destinations that are trending at the moment are the Silk Road places of Uzbekistan, walking trips in Europe, Italy. We've got a trip out there at the moment in the Apennines. Jordan and Oman and Egypt are really trending, and Namibia and Botswana are looking good. The next webinar, I shall be on my own next time talking about India and Kashmir. So before I ended up in Sri Lanka, I was in India and Kashmir, and I'll talk to you about that, how India is recovering after the pandemic and how Kashmir is these days, which I have to say is very much open for business. So if you've ever wanted to go to Kashmir, please tune in then. That's Thursday, the 26th of May, 1800 again, British summertime. We're still operating our lower deposits of £200 or $250, 20% on a tailor-made trip, and we still have our COVID promise. So I see there's still quite a lot of people here, so let's see if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing. Mike, if you want to join us. I haven't seen the Q&A, so if there are some, Gavin, do you want to turn your, yeah, there we go, great.
Yeah,
Mike.
well, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Jonny, Gavin, that was wonderful. I know I'm desperate to visit Sri Lanka now, and hopefully many of you are too. We've had some great questions in. We're running a bit low on time, so we'll try and get through all of those, but any we don't, we'll answer in the email we send out tomorrow. So the first question is from, well, Anonymous, who asks, how is the bug situation, e.g. mosquitoes and flies? That's possibly one for you, Gavin.
Can I just quickly butt in there? Because, okay, I without means going into too much detail, I react badly to mosquito bites, and I do not like getting bitten. So I have now got myself, you'll see my clothes that I wear on these trips if you watch the videos. They're called, and I'm not sponsored by Craghoppers, but they're Craghoppers Nosy Life, and they're brilliant. And I didn't get bitten once on my trip in Sri Lanka. In fact, to be honest, I don't think I even saw a mosquito, but no, I didn't get bitten at all. Gavin, have you got anything else to add on that?
No, not really. I mean, bites can be a problem. You can. I've been very badly bitten around the coast. The good news is that one of the great success stories of Sri Lanka is they have eradicated malaria. So even if you do get bitten, you're not going to get malaria anymore, and you don't need to take tablets. So you might get bitten, but their harm is bites.
Yeah,
that's good to know, Gavin. Great. Jane asks, when is the best time to visit Sri Lanka if you want to include diving? That's one for you, Gavin.
Oh, yeah. It depends on which coast you're going, because obviously there's dive sites there's really great dive sites both west coast and east coast. So if you're diving on the west coast, the best time is going to be roughly November to April. East coast is going to be roughly April to September.
Great, thanks, Gavin. Margaret would like to know what's the best currency to bring, and where can you change money, and can you give a few examples of costs for things like train tickets, meals, that kind of thing?
Gavin? Am I answering that one?
Oh yes, sorry, Gavin.
I normally, when I go to Sri Lanka, I just take some pounds as kind of emergency backup, but I always just take money out of ATMs in the country. I don't really plan on changing currency. I just have an emergency store. I get all the cash I need. There's ATMs everywhere. They take Visa, they take MasterCard, very reliable. I've never had any issues accessing money at all.
No, and to be I used my card at hotels and stuff. I just paid on my card, and that was fine. So I think the days of needing kind of a lot of local currency aren't as relevant as they used to be. Of course, you do need a bit for you know, trinkets and stuff like that, but I didn't need that much. As far as costs for particular things are concerned, obviously in some of the smarter hotels, you can be paying a reasonable amount. But I mean, I think a beer cost me about £1. I'm not sure about train tickets. Would you know that, Gavin? I think they're quite cheap.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, it's going to vary slightly by route and class, but they're so cheap. I don't really remember how much they are. I mean, probably you could probably ride the whole hill country line from Kandy to Badulla, which is a 7-hour trip, and I'm guessing it might cost you a £5, something like that.
Yeah,
I hope I haven't got that terribly wrong, but it's not a big expense. Train travel is very cheap.
A bit cheaper than the UK then.
Yeah. Oh God, yes, so much cheaper.
This is probably another one for you, Gavin. It's from Harlan, who asks, well, basically a simple question of Yala versus Udawalawa. I assume that's in terms of wildlife viewing.
Yeah.
Which would you recommend?
Yala.
Yala.
Yala's amazing. Udawalawa's lovely for elephants, but it's not so much for other stuff. Yala's just amazing. It's got such a fabulous all-round array of wildlife. Obviously, it's got leopards, but it's also got brilliant elephants, loads of other stuff, brilliant birds, crocodiles, monkeys, everything. And it's got the most fabulous scenery. It's sort of this coastal landscape with these huge boulders everywhere. It's a really strange, dramatic, interesting landscape. Yeah, Yala every time.
Okay, great, thank you. And Alice, another wildlife related question. Alice is asking, do the elephants in Sri Lanka not have tusks? I'm assuming she's seen a few of the photos where they're missing tusks.
Yes, a lot of them don't, but some of them do. And funnily enough, only elephants with certain kinds of tusks are allowed in certain kinds of religious processions because the tusks are considered religiously significant. But yeah, the tuskers in Sri Lanka are relatively rare.
Great, thank you. Fran has asked if Sri Lanka would be a good place for a 2-week cycling trip. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Gavin.
Yeah, cycling could be marvelous. I mean, hill country is great for cycling. Pretty much all the country actually is great for cycling now, I think. I mean, there's not a huge amount of traffic on the roads. I mean, in many places, it's probably better than Europe now because there's relatively little traffic on the roads. Great landscapes. Yeah, a really good hiking destination. Okay. I guess possibly the only problem would be navigating or finding sort of reliable maps and working out sort of what the best route to take is. But no, should be great.
Brilliant. And I think we've got time for one more question from Grace, who asks, what type of arts and crafts, weavings, etc., would you get in Sri Lanka? Any kind of souvenirs that would be good to bring back?
I'll be honest, Sri Lanka doesn't have the sort of arts and crafts that India or Thailand or a lot of other Asian countries do. So
carving, there's definitely some wonderful carving.
There's a lot of, yeah, there's some wood carving, there's some metalwork around Kandy, there's various kinds of, I mean, there's lace around Weligama, there's you see a lot of batik as well, that's another Kandian specialty. There's statues, trinkets, bits and pieces. I've always struggled to say there's one thing one must have Sri Lankan souvenir.
A memory.
A memory. Buy a drum. I think maybe a drum is the best. Maybe either a drum or monks in Sri Lanka have these very distinctive umbrellas which are like bright yellow, or I think a bright yellow monk's umbrella. It would be my perfect Sri Lankan souvenir. Yeah, it's not as good as India or other places for arts and crafts, but there's a lot of stuff out there. But I don't think it's quite so interesting.
Brilliant. Well, there's plenty to inspire us there. Thanks very much, Gavin and Jonny. I think that's all from the Q&A.
Great. Okay, well, Gavin, thank you so much. My goodness, that was huge amounts of knowledge. Your 20 odd years of traveling to the island has certainly paid off. And thank you very much for describing it so eloquently. Great talk, and I'm sure will have inspired our viewers very much to go there. So thank you so much. Mike, thank you for hosting, and above all, thank all of you for watching. Thanks and good night.